This is a real incident from my life, one I never imagined would unfold the way it did. Even now, when I think back to the moment it all began, my hands still tremble as if they're reliving it. It started with the cold slam of a wooden door and the sight of my daughter's wedding invitation, my own daughter, addressed to everyone but me. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter, like a taunt, cream-colored with elegant silver script, announcing the union of Rachel Marie Carter and Jonathan Blake. Yet nowhere not, in the carefully worded lines or embossed seal, was there a mention of her father. I had been erased deliberately surgically, as though I were a stain they needed to cover. The wedding was set in Charleston, South Carolina, at the French Huguenot Church, a place I knew well from my years of raising Rachel nearby. And now, as I stared at the invitation, it hit me, my ex-wife. Diane had succeeded in her long campaign to turn my own child against me. I wasn't just unwelcome. I had been rewritten out of existence. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows, I suppose. To understand how I reached the point where I became both judge and ghost. You need to know the history, the cracks in the walls before the house collapsed. Diane and I met in Columbia in the late 70s, when I was still in law school at the University of South Carolina. She was magnetic, a woman who knew how to make every man in a room orbit her, like she was the sun. I was ambitious but awkward, the first in my family to pursue law, carrying the weight of every sacrifice my parents had made. She loved my drive, she said, and I mistook that admiration for love itself. We married in '79 and had Rachel in '82. For the first few years, I believed in the picture we presented, the tidy suburban home in Mount Pleasant barbecues, with neighbors, Sunday mornings at First Scots Presbyterian. But beneath that image, Diane had already begun her slow rewriting of me. She called it protecting Rachel from disappointment. If I missed a school play because of a trial, Diane whispered to our daughter that her daddy cared more about strangers than his own family. If I raised my voice during an argument, Diane told Rachel I was unstable, dangerous, even. By the time Rachel was 12, I was no longer dad. I was him. The divorce in 1997 was brutal. South Carolina courts back then leaned heavily in favor of mothers, and Diane knew exactly how to wield her charisma. She painted me as a workaholic with a temper dangerous to the stability of our daughter. Despite my clean record, despite witnesses who vouched for me, I watched the gavel fall and custody land squarely in her lap. From then on, I became the visitor. Supervised holidays, limited phone calls, a father only on paper. Each year, Rachel drifted further from me until birthdays became silent and holidays were answered with excuses. Eventually, she stopped returning my calls entirely. But life has a way of circling back in cruel, ironic loops. I built my career, quietly climbing the rungs of the legal system, while my personal life remained in ruins. By the time I turned 71, I had retired once, already only to be pulled back into service as a senior judge in the Charleston County Courthouse. It was meant to be temporary, a favor to old colleagues I didn't know. Fate was drawing me into the most personal trial of my life. The case landed on my docket in the spring of 2024. It was a civil dispute and inheritance battle involving the estate of a wealthy businessman from Hilton Head. When I opened the case file, my heart stalled. The plaintiff's representative was none other than my ex-wife, Diane, and the primary witness listed was Rachel. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. Surely fate wouldn't be so cruel. Yet there it was, black and white. The very people who had erased me from their lives now stood before me, their future entangled in my judgment. When they entered the courtroom for the first hearing, I don't think they recognized me immediately. My hair was grayer, my posture more rigid from years behind the bench. But when Diane's eyes locked on mine, I saw the flash of recognition followed by something else. Fear. Rachel, on the other hand, avoided looking at me altogether. As the proceedings began, I kept my composure. Judicial neutrality, the very core of my profession, demanded it. But inside, I was burning. Every word they spoke, every smug argument Diane made, every cold glance. Rachel refused me, fueled the fire of decades-long humiliation. They had erased me from family, from memory, from identity. Now, unknowingly, they had placed themselves in my courtroom. I listened silently, taking note of every inconsistency, every exaggeration Diane tried to pass off as fact. My colleagues always said I had a talent for spotting liars, but this time it was personal. Yet beneath my professional calm, a storm brewed. This wasn't just about the case. This was about years of stolen birthdays, unanswered letters, the empty chair at my daughter's graduation. This was about a father who had been erased and who now had the power to write the final chapter. And so, while I banged the gavel and declared the first recess, I already knew I would not simply preside. I would plan. I would unravel them. Not with anger, but with the very justice they once used against me. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that this trial would become their undoing. I barely slept that night after the first hearing. The image of Diane, standing at the plaintiff's table, her hair still impeccably styled, like the woman I once knew, but her mouth curling with that same venomous smirk, haunted me. Worse still was Rachel's silence. She had sat in the witness gallery, stiff-backed eyes fixed anywhere but me. My own daughter, whom I once rocked to sleep in a nursery, painted yellow, with hand-drawn suns on the walls, now pretended I didn't exist. Lying in bed, the ceiling fan slicing shadows across the room, I thought about the irony. For years, they had treated me as irrelevant, erased me from Rachel's milestones, her wedding, even her life. And yet now their fortunes, their reputations, even their financial survival might hinge on the judgment of the man they had erased. But this wasn't about revenge, at least not yet. This was about justice. And justice, I reminded myself, must be deliberate. The case itself revolved around a contested will. A Hilton Head real estate magnate, Richard Halloway, had died, leaving behind a sizable estate properties on the Coast business shares, and millions in assets Diane claimed she was entitled to a portion through her late husband, her second husband. I realized with bitter amusement who had been Halloway's business partner. Rachel was listed as a beneficiary through convoluted trusts Diane argued were unfairly withheld by Halloway's children. On paper, it was a complex but routine inheritance squabble. In reality, it was a performance stage, and Diane had always been a master actress. She painted herself as a grieving widow, wronged by greedy heirs, her words dripping with rehearsed sorrow. Rachel, meanwhile, was meant to be her supporting pillar, a respectable witness to bolster Diane's credibility. But I knew better. Diane's grief was a mask, one she had worn countless times, and Rachel, though innocent in her youth, had been molded by her mother's narrative so thoroughly that she now served as an extension of Diane's will. The next day in court, I walked in with a calmness that belied the storm inside me. The bailiff announced my entrance, and as I settled into the high-backed chair of authority, I scanned the room deliberately. Diane wouldn't meet my eyes at first, but when she finally did, she faltered just for a fraction of a second. That flicker of recognition was enough. She knew the balance of power had shifted. Rachel sat at her mother's side, dressed in a tailored navy suit, her dark hair pinned neatly. She looked older than the child I remembered, of course, but her features were still achingly familiar. Her jawline mean, her eye sockets filled with joy when I entered a room, now hardened cold. The attorneys began their arguments, but I barely heard them. My attention was fixed on Rachel, trying to find the smallest crack in her facade. Would she glance at me? Would some buried memory steer a Christmas morning, a bedtime story, a hand held while crossing King Street downtown? But she never looked. Not once I forced myself back to the case. Diane's attorney was slick, but not as careful as he thought. He leaned on emotional appeals, rather than hard evidence, repeating that Diane Carter and her daughter Rachel were cruelly excluded from what rightfully belonged to them. I asked pointed questions, each one cutting through his rhetoric. His answers faltered under scrutiny. Diane's lips tightened. By midday, the courtroom buzzed with unease. Reporters had begun trickling in. Inheritance cases involving local elites always drew attention, but I suspected they also smelled something else. The quiet tension between judge and litigant, something they couldn't yet name. That night I opened an old box in my study. Inside were relics of the years Diane had stolen from me. Birthday cards returned, unopened photographs of Rachel, at 6, at 10, at 15, each one showing me only from a distance. There was a letter I had written Rachel on her high school graduation day, never delivered. I read it now. My own handwriting. Foreign after so many years. I love you more than words, Rachel. No matter what you've been told, no matter how far we are, I will always be your father. The paper shook in my hand. The injustice of it all pressed so heavily on my chest I thought I might choke. But then I remembered Diane had erased me before. This time, I had the pen. The third day of hearings brought the first witness testimony. Diane herself took the stand. Watching her raise her right hand, swearing to tell the truth, was almost comical. I had lived through decades of her lies. Truth to Diane was whatever served her best. She spoke eloquently, recounting her deep bond with her late husband and her supposed contributions to his business dealings. She painted herself as indispensable, her voice trembling with rehearsed vulnerability. But when I asked her a series of procedural clarifications, dates of contracts, specifics of business decisions, her answers grew shaky. She hedged, she deflected. I didn't show it outwardly, but inside, I catalogued each misstep. Then came Rachel. When she approached the stand, I felt my chest tighten. She didn't glance at me, not even in passing. Her oath was steady, her posture perfect. The little girl who once ran barefoot across Isle of Palms Beach, clutching seashells, was gone. In her place stood a woman forged by Diane's narratives. Her testimony was measured. She spoke of her stepfather, Diane's late husband, as a generous man who had treated her like his own. She claimed he had promised she would be cared for, that the estate division excluding her was a cruel oversight. Her voice never wavered, but I listened closely. Promises made in passing were not the same as contractual obligations, and Rachel, for all her poise, leaned heavily on, he said, rather than verifiable proof. Still hearing her speak so passionately, not only erasing me but replacing me with another man. In her version of family was a knife to the gut. I clenched my gavel so tightly, I thought the wood might splinter. The attorneys finished their questioning, and I thanked her with the same even tone I gave every witness. But when she stepped down, I caught something, just the faintest hesitation, in her walk. It was as if, for the briefest moment, she considered looking my way. She didn't, but that pause gave me hope. The courtroom emptied after adjournment, but I stayed behind, staring at the empty witness chair. For years, I had been powerless. I had watched from the sidelines as my role was stolen. Now here I was, seated in the very symbol of power, while they stood exposed before me. But power I knew was fragile. I couldn't misuse it. If I let revenge blind me, I'd lose the very justice I wanted to wield. I needed to be precise. I needed to let Diane bury herself with her own arrogance. Let Rachel see the cracks in her mother's empire. That night, I began drafting meticulous notes, cross-referencing Diane's testimony with public records, real estate contracts, tax filings, partnership agreements. Many were accessible in Charleston's archives, and as I dug, I found the first thread discrepancies in dates Diane had given. If pulled carefully, that thread could unravel her entire claim. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion creeping in, but for the first time in decades, I felt a sense of purpose burn through me. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was the battlefield, where I would reclaim my voice, not with shouting, not with bitterness, but with undeniable truth. The war had only begun, and Diane had no idea. I had just discovered the weapon that could shatter her carefully constructed lies. When the courtroom doors opened, the next morning, I was ready, not just as a judge, but as a father, long denied his place. And as fate would have it, the next witness to take the stand was someone who would bring my carefully buried past, hurtling into the present in ways I never expected. The bailiff's voice echoed through the courtroom as the next witness was sworn in. I had expected another business associate of Richard Halloway, maybe a family accountant or an old colleague, to testify about the estate. But when the name rolled off the clerk's tongue, my pulse spiked. Michael Jameson. The name dragged me back 30 years in an instant. Michael Jameson wasn't just some random connection. He had been Diane's shadow during the last years of our marriage, her family friend, her confidant. The man I once suspected of being more, though I never had the evidence. He walked to the stand. Slowly, a man in his late 60s now, with thinning hair and a paunch that spoke of decades of comfort. But his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, hadn't dulled. He glanced at Diane as he passed, and I caught the flicker of familiarity, a secret code in their gaze. Old allies, still bound. I gripped the gavel tighter. Of all the people to surface, now it had to be him. Michael raised his right hand, swore the oath, and sat. Diane's attorney asked the opening questions, guiding him gently toward their narrative. Michael testified that he had worked alongside Richard Halloway, that he knew the deep friendship between Richard and Diane, that he'd personally heard Richard express intentions to provide for Rachel as though she were his blood. His words slid smoothly rehearsed. He painted a picture of generosity, of promises that stretched beyond legal contracts. Diane watched with a serene smile, her hands folded, her performance complete. Rachel's face was unreadable, but I noticed how intently she followed his words, like scripture confirming the gospel her mother had long preached. I let the attorneys move through their script, but when it came time for judicial questioning, I leaned forward. "Mr. Jameson," I said evenly, my voice carrying through the chamber. "You stated that Mr. Halloway expressed intentions toward Ms. Carter and her daughter. Could you provide specific dates for these conversations?" Michael hesitated just slightly. He can't recall the exact dates, Your Honor. But it was during the early 2000s, tens many occasions, approximate dates. Then I pressed month-year context of the conversation. He shifted in his seat. "Well, I remember one in 2011, after a board meeting. He said Rachel was like a daughter to him." I nodded slowly. And were you present for any formal documentation of this intent? Wills, trusts, amendments? No. Not formal. He admitted, but verbal assurances were clear. The courtroom buzzed faintly at that verbal assurances, worthless in probate disputes. Diane's jaw tightened. She must have known I'd slice through vague recollections like a scalpel. I dismissed him back to cross-examination, but my mind burned. Here he was, the man who had hovered around Diane as she dismantled my life. Now he was back playing witness to her new con. And though I couldn't expose our past in court, I could damn sure unravel him with facts. That evening, I went home restless. I pulled out the files again, cross-referencing Michael's statements with the estate records. Something felt off. His timeline didn't align. He spoke of board meetings in 2011, but Holloway's documented business partners from that period didn't include him. I called an old colleague still in Hilton Head's circuit. By midnight, confirmation arrived. Michael Jameson had divested from Holloway's ventures by 2009. He had lied under oath. It was subtle, but it was enough. And once I exposed it, Diane's entire narrative would wobble. If her star witness crumbled, so would her case. But the most unexpected blow came not from Diane, nor Michael, but Rachel herself. The following day, as we recessed for lunch, Rachel lingered in the hallway outside the courtroom. I stepped out moments later, flanked by clerks, when I felt her presence before I saw her. She stood by the marble column, arms crossed, gaze finally locked on me. It was the first time in decades she had looked at me directly. My throat tightened. "Judge Carter," she said formally. Her voice clipped. I stopped Rachel. The word escaped before I could contain it. Just her name spoken like a prayer. I'd waited years to say aloud. Her lips pressed thin. "You shouldn't be presiding over this case. It's a conflict of interest." I searched her face for anything, softness, recognition, but found only steel. "If you feel that way, you're entitled to file a motion for recusal. Has your counsel advised you to do so?" Her jaw tightened. "No, but I will." I nodded, trying to remain steady though my chest ached. "That's your right." For a moment silence stretched between us. Then softer she asked, "Why are you even here, after all these years?" The question sliced deeper than any courtroom challenge. My voice caught, but I steadied it. "Because this is my duty. Because justice matters. Even now." Her eyes flickered, something between anger and confusion. But then she turned sharply, heels clicking against the marble floor, leaving me with the ghost of a daughter I barely knew anymore. That night I wrestled with guilt. Was she right? Should I step aside? A father judging his estranged family. It was messy, complicated, dangerous. But I also knew stepping aside would hand Diane a victory. And worse, it would cement Rachel's belief that I was weak, that I could be erased again. No, not this time. The fourth day in court was electric. Reporters packed the gallery, now sensing drama. Diane's attorney attempted to solidify Michael's testimony, but I had already prepared my strike. "Mr. Jameson," I said, "during questioning, you testified about a board meeting in 2011. Court records, however, show you sold your shares and severed ties with Mr. Holloway's businesses in 2009. How do you reconcile this?" The silence that followed was deafening. Michael's face paled. He stammered, backpedaled, but the damage was done. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Diane's composure cracked. Her fingers tightened on the table edge. Her eyes flashing with a fury she quickly tried to mask. Rachel's face fell, confusion, written plainly now. For the first time she looked at me not with hate, not with distance, but with uncertainty. I dismissed Michael, noting for the record that his credibility was severely compromised. It was the closest I could come to saying, "You've been caught lying through your teeth." When I adjourned for the day, I caught Diane's gaze one last time. She knew I had her cornered, and for once she had no ready mask. But victory wasn't secure. Yet Diane was cunning in cornered animals. Lash out, hardest, and Rachel, me daughter, my blood, was beginning to see the cracks in her mother's empire. Whether she would turn away from it or cling to it, even tighter, remained the question that gnawed at me through the night. As I lay awake, I couldn't shake one thought: the war was tilting, yes. But the battle for Rachel's heart had only just begun. The morning after Michael's collapse on the stand, Charleston felt heavier than usual. The sky was low and gray, and a steady drizzle blurred the courthouse windows. I arrived early, my shoes echoing across the empty marble hallway. For decades I had dreaded entering courtrooms when my personal life collided with my professional one. Now I stood in the very heart of it. Diane arrived late, flanked by her attorney and Rachel. She carried herself with the same swagger she always had, though I saw the tremor in her hands as she adjusted her pearl necklace. She was furious, but she wouldn't show weakness. Not Diane. When the bailiff called the session to order, I noticed the gallery was packed. Reporters, spectators, law students hungry for drama. The case had become a local sensation. The senior judge presiding over a case involving his ex-wife and estranged daughter. Rumors swirled, but I ignored them. Diane's attorney wasted no time. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "we are filing a motion for recusal. We believe your involvement in this case constitutes a conflict of interest. Given your prior marriage to Ms. Carter and your relation to her daughter, this trial cannot be considered impartial." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. I felt Rachel's eyes burning into me. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding, but my voice remained calm. I anticipated this motion. "Do you have evidence to suggest that my rulings thus far have shown bias?" The attorney hesitated. "Not specifically, but the appearance of bias alone is sufficient grounds." I let the silence stretch before answering. Appearance is not enough. The law requires proof of actual bias. My decisions have been based solely on fact and record. If the counsel wishes to appeal at a higher court, that is their right. But until then, this motion is denied. The gavel struck sharp as thunder. The attorney flinched. Diane's lips curled into a cold smile. She wasn't defeated, only regrouping. The hearing moved forward, but the tension was palpable. Every question, every objection, carried the weight of personal history. And then came Diane's retaliation. Her attorney called a surprise witness me. The courtroom gasped. My clerks froze. Even I was stunned for a moment before recovering. "Explain yourself," I said firmly. "Your Honor." Diane's attorney said, "We believe your past conduct is relevant to this case. As Rachel's father and Diane's former husband, your credibility and history with the family must be examined. We request you step down from the bench to testify." It was a brazen move. Improper, even judges don't testify in their own courtrooms. But Diane wasn't aiming for propriety. She was aiming for spectacle. To humiliate me publicly the way she had in private decades earlier. I adjusted my glasses, eyes narrowing. Denied. This is not a custody trial. My history with the parties is not material to the disposition of this estate. If you attempt to bring this line of argument again, I will hold you in contempt. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The attorney sat down quickly, his confidence punctured. Diane's cheeks flushed crimson, her composure cracking. Rachel, though she looked stricken, conflicted, as if for the first time she was questioning the narrative her mother had fed her all these years. The day dragged on, filled with testimony from accountants and estate lawyers. But my mind kept circling back to Diane's attempt to drag me down. She hadn't changed. She was still the woman who weaponized lies and appearances to win, and she'd just shown her hand. She was desperate. That night I dug deeper. I had already uncovered Michael's lies. Now I wanted something bigger, something to end Diane's case entirely. I requested old financial records, pulling strings with colleagues who still owed me favors. Hours later, buried in stacks of PDFs and scanned documents, I found discrepancies in Diane's financial affidavits. She had claimed dependence on her late husband's estate, yet the records showed she had liquidated assets quietly years earlier, assets she never disclosed in court filings. Offshore accounts, wire transfers to the Cayman Islands, and large withdrawals coinciding with Rachel's college years. My breath caught. Diane had been hiding wealth while presenting herself as the wronged widow. If I introduced this into the record, her credibility would shatter completely. But then came the dilemma to use it. I would have to bring Rachel into the storm. The withdrawals linked to tuition payments in her name. Diane had used their secret money trail to pay for Rachel's education at Duke University. If I exposed it, Rachel would be caught in the fallout. I sat there for hours, staring at the evidence torn between justice and fatherhood. What kind of man exposes his daughter's college funding as part of a fraud? And yet, what kind of judge ignores a crime staring him in the face? The next morning, I walked into the courtroom with the documents tucked neatly in my folder. My decision wasn't final, but I was ready. Diane strutted in, oblivious to what I held. Rachel followed quietly, her eyes less certain now, her steps slower. When the session began, Diane's attorney tried to regain control, parading minor witnesses to bolster their case. But the more they spoke, the more obvious it became that their foundation was crumbling. Finally, I could wait no longer. "Counsel," I interrupted before we proceed further. "The court requires clarification on certain financial disclosures." Diane stiffened. Her attorney fumbled. I lifted the documents. Bank records indicate undisclosed assets tied to Ms. Carter. Accounts offshore, significant withdrawals and discrepancies between reported income and actual transfers. Can you explain this, Ms. Carter? The courtroom exploded in whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously. Diane's face went ashen, then red. She stammered. "Those funds were private, unrelated, my late husband." "Answer the question," I cut in my tone, sharp. "Why were these assets omitted from your sworn financial statements?" Rachel turned to her mother, eyes wide. "Mom, what is he talking about?" Diane snapped. "Quiet." Rachel. The crack in her mask was complete. The jury, the gallery, even. Rachel, everyone saw it. Diane was cornered, her lies unraveling under the very man she had once erased. I adjourned for the day, amid chaos. As I gathered my papers, Rachel lingered at the edge of the courtroom. For the second time, she looked at me directly. This time her eyes weren't cold. They were wounded, searching. "Is it true?" she whispered when the room had mostly emptied. Did she really lie about all this money? I hesitated. My throat tightened. "Rachel, I wish I didn't have to show you like this. But yes, it's true." Her face crumpled. She turned away, her shoulders trembling, then stormed out without another word. I watched her go, my chest heavy. I had struck Diane where it hurt most, but in the process, I had wounded Rachel too. Still, this was the cost of truth. Diane had built her empire of lies for decades, and I was finally methodically dismantling it, brick by brick. As I left the courthouse that evening, I knew one thing for certain. The next phase would be war. Diane would not go down quietly. She would fight like a cornered animal. But I was ready for the first time in decades. I wasn't the erased man in the shadows. I was the judge, and I would write the ending this time. The next morning, the courthouse was a storm. before the storm. Local news vans lined Broad Street, their antennas stabbing the sky reporters crowding the steps, like vultures circling fresh carrion. My clerks whispered that the case had exploded across Charleston headlines. Judge presiding over ex-wife's case. Exposes hidden fortune. Inside the gallery was overflowing. Even the upper balcony, usually empty, was packed with curious onlookers. Law students retired, attorneys, gossip hounds. They all wanted to see whether Diane Carter, once the queen of manipulation, would crumble in public. When Diane entered, she was no longer the polished widow. Her hair was tightly pulled back, her makeup heavier than usual, almost defiant. Rachel trailed behind her, pale and shaken, her eyes hollow from a sleepless night. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at her mother either. The bailiff called the court to order, and the room fell into silence. I could feel every eye drilling into me, waiting for the next clash. Diane's attorney stood immediately, his voice strained. Your Honor, we object to the introduction of the so-called evidence presented yesterday. These records were obtained improperly and are irrelevant to the matter at hand. This case concerns the estate of Richard Halloway, not Ms. Carter's private finances. I leaned forward. Counsel, financial disclosures are required when determining claims of dependency and entitlement. If Ms. Carter concealed assets, that goes directly to the credibility of her claim. The attorney sputtered, but he knew the point was ironclad. Diane sat rigid, her knuckles white against the table. I turned to her. Ms. Carter, do you wish to explain these discrepancies yourself? For the first time, her mask cracked in front of everyone. Those funds were for Rachel, she hissed. For her education. For her future. You think you know everything, but you don't know what it was like raising her alone while you... Her voice caught, and she cut herself off. But the damage was done. Rachel's head snapped toward her, eyes wide. What are you talking about? I thought Rachel. Diane snapped. Not here. But it was too late. The courtroom had heard. The whispers swelled like a tide. I slammed the gavel order. The rest of the session unraveled with bitter testimony and scrambling attorneys. Diane tried to claw back control, but every word she spoke only revealed her desperation. The press smelled blood. By afternoon, recess headlines were already pinging phones across the gallery. During lunch break, I stayed in my chambers, but I could hear the commotion outside, reporters yelling questions, cameras flashing, Diane's sharp voice rising above the chaos. She had chosen to fight, not just inside the courtroom, but out in the streets. I asked a clerk to pull the footage later, and when I saw it, I nearly laughed. Diane stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by her attorney, pointing at the cameras like a politician on the campaign trail. This is nothing more than a vendetta, she declared. My ex-husband has been waiting decades for an opportunity to humiliate me, and now he's using his bench to do it. This is not justice. It's revenge, pure and simple. The crowd gasped. Reporters shouted over one another. Diane thrived in the attention, her voice rising with false righteousness. But then, the cameras caught Rachel in the background, arms crossed, lips tight, refusing to stand beside her mother. That image alone spread like wildfire online. Mother railing, daughter recoiling. By the time court resumed, the air was electric. Every eye darted between us, waiting for fireworks. Diane's fury simmered, but she avoided another outburst. Rachel, though, sat stiff, her eyes darting to me more often now, as though measuring me against the lies she'd been told all her life. The afternoon brought a crucial witness for the defense, one of Halloway's children, Thomas. He was sharp, articulate, and carried the weight of legitimacy. He testified that his father had left clear instructions that Diane's claims were baseless, and that the supposed promises were nothing more than manipulations. As he spoke, Rachel shifted uncomfortably. I could almost see the walls crumbling around her. The fortress Diane had built, brick by brick since Rachel's childhood. I adjourned the court just before dusk. The tension spilling into the humid Charleston air reporters swarmed again. But I slipped out through a side exit, exhausted. That night, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat on the porch, the cicadas droning in the distance. My hands shook as I raised the glass. I had dreamed of exposing Diane for years, but I never imagined Rachel would be forced to watch her mother unravel like this. A knock pulled me from my thoughts. It was tentative, hesitant. I opened the door and froze. Rachel stood there. Her eyes were red, her hair loose from its pins, her face pale in the porch light. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Rachel," I breathed. She swallowed hard. "Can I come in?" My heart pounded as I stepped aside. She walked in, slowly glancing around the house as though seeing ghosts of a life she'd been denied. We sat at the kitchen table, the silence thick. Finally, she spoke, her voice small. "Is it true about the money?" "Yes," I said gently. "I wouldn't have brought it forward otherwise." She closed her eyes, shaking her head. "All my life she told me you were the liar, that you abandoned us, that everything she did was to protect me." Her voice cracked, and now I don't know what to believe anymore. I reached across the table, not touching her, but resting my hand near hers. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But Rachel, I never abandoned you. I was erased. I fought for you until the courts stripped me bare. I wrote letters. I came to your games, your recitals. Even when I wasn't allowed, she made sure you never saw me." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't remember any of that." "That's what she wanted," I whispered. "But it's the truth." For a long moment she sat in silence, tears slipping down her cheeks. Then she whispered, "I don't know who to believe anymore, but I think I want to find out for myself." It was the first spark of hope I'd felt in decades. When she left, she didn't hug me. She didn't even promise to come back. But she turned at the door and whispered, "Good night, Dad." The word hit me like a thunderclap. Small, fragile, but real. The war with Diane was far from over. She would lash out again more viciously than before. But for the first time, I wasn't just fighting for revenge. I was fighting for the chance to reclaim the one thing Diane had tried hardest, to steal my daughter's truth. And I knew the final battle was coming soon, one that would decide not just the case, but the legacy of our fractured family. Charleston was buzzing like a hornet's nest the next morning. The Post and Courier headline blared, "Judge's ex-wife accused of hiding millions. Family feud spills into courtroom." Smaller papers ran with even sharper spins, love lies and offshore accounts. Some stations didn't even bother with tact. The Carter Circus, judge versus ex-wife. When I arrived at the courthouse, reporters shouted my name, cameras flashing like lightning. I didn't answer. I had one duty, to see this case through. But in my gut, I knew Diane wouldn't go quietly. Not now. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever. Diane entered like a storm cloud. Shoulders, stiff chin, raised eyes blazing with hatred. Rachel walked beside her, but kept a careful distance. She didn't even glance at her mother, and when Diane noticed her lips pressed into a sharp line, the session began, and Diana's attorney wasted no time launching their counterattack. "Your Honor," he declared, "we move once again for your recusal. This court is no longer a place of impartial justice, but a stage for a personal vendetta. Evidence shows you met privately with Ms. Carter's daughter last night. This is a gross breach of judicial ethics." A stunned silence filled the chamber. My stomach dropped. Rachel. Someone must have seen her come to my house. Charleston wasn't a city where secrets stayed buried long. I steadied my voice. Yes, Ms. Carter came to my home. She is my daughter, but no case matters were discussed. Diane leapt to her feet, fury pouring from her like acid. Liar. You've poisoned her against me. You've waited decades for this moment, and now you're trying to destroy me in front of her. Her words cracked like whips through the room. The gallery gasped. Reporters scribbled feverishly. I struck the gavel hard. Order. This is not the place for theatrics, Miss Carter. But she wouldn't stop. Years of carefully maintained poise burned away, leaving only raw venom. You always played the victim, didn't you? You were never there for her. You chose your career, your damn courtroom over your family, and now you stand there pretending you're some kind of savior. Rachel's face paled. She whispered something. Mom, stop. But Diane ignored her. You were a coward, Harold. She spat. A coward who let me raise her alone, and now you want to play judge, jury, and executioner over my life, over hers. Her voice cracked, the fury tipping into desperation. The entire courtroom sat frozen, watching her unravel. I let the silence stretch, then spoke evenly. Ms. Carter, your outburst will be stricken from the record. This is your final warning. If you disrupt proceedings again, I will hold you in contempt. Her chest heaved. For a moment I thought she might actually lunge across the room, but then slowly she sat, trembling, her face contorted with rage. Her attorney tried to recover, calling their next witness, but the damage was irreparable. The jury, the court, the press, everyone had seen it. The elegant widow mask was gone. What remained was the woman I had known in private, manipulative, venomous, desperate. Still, I knew she wasn't finished. Diane never lost without blood. That evening, as I walked to my car, I noticed the reporters swarm unusually thick. They shoved microphones into my face, asking if I had compromised the case. If Rachel's late-night visit had influenced my judgment. I kept silent, but unease gnawed at me. By the time I reached home, the ambush had escalated. 2 men in dark suits stood at my driveway, handing me a formal notice. I had been reported to the South Carolina Judicial Conduct Commission. Diane had filed an ethics complaint, accusing me of misconduct, bias, and personal involvement. If the commission decided to act, I could be suspended, even disbarred. I sat in my living room long after they left the letter, heavy in my hands. I had known this battle would get dirty, but I hadn't expected her to attack the very foundation of my career, even at 71. My phone buzzed. A text from Rachel. I didn't tell her I came. I swear, I'm sorry. I closed my eyes, tears pricking. Even in the chaos, my daughter still reached for me, fragile and uncertain, but reaching nonetheless. The next day, the court was quieter, tension hanging thick like humidity before a storm. Reporters now whispered about my future as much as Diane's lies. Would the judge even finish the trial? Would the commission intervene? I forced myself to stay steady. The evidence was on my side. The law was on my side. If Diane thought she could topple me with noise, she had forgotten who she was dealing with. The defense called one last round of witnesses. Financial experts, estate lawyers, each one reinforcing the truth. Diane's claims were riddled with deception. Her story didn't hold up under scrutiny. And then it was time for closing arguments. Diane's attorney stood, his voice a mix of defiance and desperation. He painted her as a widow, under siege, targeted by a vengeful ex-husband, abusing his bench. He even gestured to me, his words dripping with contempt. This is not just a trial about money. It is a trial about power, and how one man uses it to crush the women who defied him. The gallery buzzed, but I remained motionless. Let him have his theater. The truth didn't need theatrics when he finished. The estate's counsel stood. His argument was sharp, factual, devastating. He outlined the hidden accounts, the lies under oath, the fabricated testimonies. This case is not about a grieving widow. It is about fraud. It is about deception. And justice demands we see through it. The words hung in the air like a final tolling bell. Recessed court for deliberation. Though this wasn't a jury trial, I wanted the gravity to sink in. I sat in chambers staring at the walls, lined with decades of my career, photos of cases won, colleagues, long-gone honors I no longer cared about. This wasn't about prestige. This was about the truth, about reclaiming what Diane had stolen, about Rachel finally seeing through the fog. When I returned to the bench, the courtroom was silent. Diane sat rigid, her hands clenched. Rachel looked down at the table, her lips pressed tight. I cleared my throat, my voice steady. After careful review of the evidence, this court finds that the claims brought forth by Ms. Diane Carter are without merit. Furthermore, evidence of concealed assets and false testimony has irreparably damaged her credibility. The estate of Richard Halloway will be distributed as originally outlined in the will. Ms. Carter and her representatives are awarded nothing. The gavel struck. The sound echoed like thunder. The gallery erupted, some gasped, some cheered softly. Reporters scribbled furiously. Diane froze her face, draining of color. For once she had no words, no mask, no power, only silence. Rachel sat still, her hands trembling. She didn't look at her mother. She looked at me. Not with warmth, not yet, but with recognition, with something new. The trial was over, but the reckoning wasn't. As I left the courtroom, I knew Diane would keep clawing through the press, through appeals, through the ethics complaint she had filed. But she was finished in the eyes of the law. Her empire had collapsed. The real question was whether my daughter would finally see who had been standing in the ruins with her all along. The courthouse emptied like a theater after the final act, but the echoes of that gavel strike clung to the walls. I sat motionless for a long while, watching the room clear, the chatter of reporters spilling into the humid Charleston night. Diane didn't move. She stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched as if sheer will could undo the judgment that had just crushed her case. Rachel sat beside her, but the bond between them looked frayed, nearly severed. She didn't touch her mother. She didn't speak. She only stared at her trembling hands, lost in thought. Finally, Diane stood her chair, screeching across the tile. She leaned close to Rachel and hissed something I couldn't hear. Rachel's eyes flinched, but she didn't answer. Then Diane stormed out, cameras flashing as reporters swarmed her in the hallway. Rachel lingered. She looked at me across the courtroom. The first time, perhaps ever, she saw me not as a stranger or a ghost, but as the man at the center of it all. Her lips parted as though to say something, but then she lowered her gaze and walked out quietly. I sat back, my chest heavy. The war was won, yes. Diane's lies lay in ruins, her fortune exposed, her credibility shattered. But wars leave scars, and mine was the fragile, uncertain bond with my daughter. The following week was chaos. Diane exploded in the media, accusing me of corruption, bias, revenge. She appeared on local news, framed in soft lighting, clutching tissues she never used, claiming she was a victim of judicial abuse. Some believed her. Many didn't. The Judicial Conduct Commission summoned me. I stood before them, shoulders squared, presenting my record of rulings, my impartial handling of the case, the evidence itself. It was a tense, grueling review, but in the end, they cleared me. No misconduct, no bias. I walked out of that building lighter than I had in years. Diane had lost, not just her case, but her last weapon against me, but victory brought no joy. At night, I sat alone in my house, the silence pressing in. I thought of Rachel's face, her tears, at my kitchen table, her whispered, Good night, Dad. That word still echoed inside me, fragile and precious but unfinished. 2 weeks later, a knock came at my door. When I opened it, Rachel stood there again. This time she carried a small cardboard box. Her hair was loose, her face tired, but softer than before. "Hi," she said quietly. I stepped aside without a word. She walked in and set the box on the table. When she opened it, my breath caught. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Me holding her as a baby, me pushing her on a swing at Waterfront Park, me at her 8th birthday party holding a cake while Diane smiled tightly beside me. "Mom kept these," Rachel whispered. "In the attic." Hidden away, I picked up one photo with trembling hands. Rachel, no older than 6, sat on my lap, a wide grin on her face, my arms wrapped around her. Proof of a bond Diane had tried to erase. "She told me you were never there. Rachel said that you didn't care, that these moments didn't matter. But when I saw these, I knew she'd been lying for years." Tears blurred my vision. I reached across the table this time, daring to place my hand over hers. She didn't pull away. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "For believing her. For cutting you out." I shook my head. "You were a child. None of this was your fault. She poisoned everything, but you're here now. That's what matters." Her shoulders shook as she began to cry, and for the first time in decades, I pulled my daughter into my arms. She let me. The weeks that followed were slow and fragile. Rachel began visiting more often cautiously, like testing the waters of a relationship she'd been denied. We talked about her life, her career, her marriage. She told me about Jonathan, the husband whose wedding I had been excluded from. To my surprise, she admitted he had asked once years ago why I hadn't been at the ceremony Diane had answered for her. He didn't care enough to come. The cruelty of it burned, but I didn't let it consume me. Instead, I listened, I learned. And little by little, Rachel began to see me, not as the shadow her mother had painted, but as a man of flesh, blood, and love. Meanwhile, Diane's empire collapsed. With her case thrown out and her hidden finances exposed, creditors came knocking. The press no longer treated her as a grieving widow, but as a schemer. She tried appeals, lawsuits, smear campaigns, but each effort failed. Even Michael Jameson distanced himself, his own reputation too. Tarnished by his perjury, Rachel confronted her mother one final time. She told me about it afterward, her voice steady but heavy. She screamed at me. Rachel said, I'd betrayed her. Said, I was choosing you over her. But it wasn't a choice between parents. It was a choice between truth and lies. She wiped a tear from her cheek. I told her I was done, letting her control my life, and then I walked out. I wanted to cheer, to rage, to weep all at once. Instead, I just pulled her close and whispered, I'm proud of you. Months passed. Life settled. Diane faded from headlines. Her name now whispered in Charleston with disdain. Instead of awe, I returned to quieter duties on the bench, my temporary service nearing its end. But one day, as autumn leaves drifted across the courthouse steps, I found myself alone in the empty courtroom. I sat at the bench, staring at the wood grain beneath my hands. This room had been the site of my humiliation, my redemption, and the unraveling of decades-long lies. Rachel walked in quietly. She'd come to meet me for lunch. She looked around the courtroom, then up at me, sitting in the judge's chair. Funny, she said softly. All these years Mom told me you didn't matter. But in the end, you were the one who mattered most. I swallowed hard. I didn't want it to be this way. I didn't want revenge to be the thing that brought you back to me. She walked closer, smiling faintly. Maybe it wasn't revenge. Maybe it was justice, and maybe justice is what finally set me free. Her words lingered in the chamber like a benediction. Diane vanished from our lives. I heard whispers she sold her Mount Pleasant house, moved somewhere inland, bitter and broken. I didn't follow her story. For once, I didn't care. My war with her was finished. Rachel and I rebuilt slowly. We shared dinners, stories, memories. We laughed about the little things like her childhood, fear of the dark, the way she used to beg me to read Charlotte's Web one more time before bed. One evening she asked, "Do you ever regret it? Becoming a judge, devoting your life to the law, knowing what it cost." I thought about it. The decades lost, the nights alone, the daughter stolen, and then I looked at her sitting across the table. Finally mine again. "No," I said softly, because in the end it gave me the one thing I thought I'd lost forever. Her eyes shimmered. She reached across the table this time, taking my hand first. The story should end here, neatly tied with justice and reconciliation. But real life rarely offers neat endings. Sometimes late at night, I think about Diane, about the venom in her voice, the years she stole, and I wonder if she lies awake somewhere too haunted by the day her lies crumbled under the weight of truth. I don't hate her anymore. Hatred is too heavy to carry at 71. What I carry instead is colder, quieter. The memory of a gavel striking, of silence falling, of a life reclaimed not with rage, but with justice, and the knowledge that the father they tried to erase became their judge. The end.